May 5th, 1941, the Baltic port of Gotenhafen, Poland. It did not merely float, it commanded the water. It was an engineering assertion of industrial power, a shadow cast across the history of naval warfare. This was the German battleship Bismarck, and to the men who saw her, and certainly to the regime that built her, she represented the apex predator of the high seas. She was the largest warship then afloat, displacing over 50,000 tons fully loaded, nearly 10,000 tons heavier than the previous generation of battleships. Her hull was a labyrinth of armor, designed not merely to withstand punishment, but to sneer at it. She carried 8 15-inch guns, grouped in 4 massive twin turrets named Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora. When these giants fired a full broadside, the sheer concussive force could be felt miles away, delivering projectiles that weighed more than an average sedan car, over distances exceeding 20 miles. This was metal perfected for destruction, wrapped in steel belts a foot thick, making her theoretically impervious to any shells fired by British cruisers or destroyers, and perhaps even their older battleships. The Bismarck was more than a ship. She was a political promise fulfilled. For Adolf Hitler and the high command of the Kriegsmarine, she symbolized the final step in Germany's resurgence as a global power, ready to challenge Britannia's centuries-long dominance of the waves. She was the physical manifestation of the idea that German technology and engineering superiority could break the logistical backbone of the Allied war effort, the Atlantic convoys. By the spring of 1941, Britain was fighting alone, utterly dependent on the continuous stream of food, raw materials, and armaments flowing from North America. The U-boat wolf packs were taking a dreadful toll, but they could not be everywhere at once. A massive surface raider capable of sinking entire convoys and tying up vast stretches of the Royal Navy in response was the strategic necessity. The Bismarck was designed precisely for this mission, to slip out into the vast emptiness of the Atlantic hunt-down and annihilate the vulnerable merchant fleets, and then vanish before the superior forces of the British home fleet could pin her down. Her speed, nearly 30 knots, gave her the crucial advantage of dictate the terms of any engagement to fight or to flee. The men who served aboard her were the elite of the German Navy, hand-picked and steeped in the fierce pride that came with serving on such a vessel. They were led by Captain Ernst Lindemann, an officer known for his meticulous professionalism, serving under the overall command of Admiral Gunther Lütens, a seasoned, though perhaps overly cautious, veteran of surface raiding operations. Their mission, designated Operation Rheinübung, was simple in scope, terrifying in implication, cripple the convoy routes and bring Britain to the brink of starvation and sewer. The British Admiralty knew what the Bismarck represented. They did not just fear her, they obsessed over her. She was not just another naval threat, she was an existential risk. If the ship reached the open Atlantic and settled into the shipping lanes, the casualty rates among the merchant fleet would soar, and Britain's capacity to fight would crumble within months. The very existence of the Bismarck dictated the movements of vast sections of the Royal Navy. Every resource, from aging biplanes flying reconnaissance to the newest, most modern battleships, was dedicated to tracking her movements from the moment she began her initial shakedown cruise in the Baltic. She was the most hunted target in the world before her guns had even been turned on an enemy. When she finally moved out into the Norwegian fjords, readying herself for the dash into the void of the Atlantic, observers on shore could only stare in awe. She was a steel leviathan, seemingly indestructible, armored like a medieval knight, yet possessed of the devastating speed and range afforded by modern technology. She carried the weight of Germany's naval ambition and the hope that the war at sea could be decisively won, not by stealthy submarines, but by overwhelming, glorious force. To the German sailors lining her massive decks, the ship was a sanctuary of power, a masterpiece that could not be matched. The notion that anything the British possessed could truly challenge this giant seemed ludicrous. Her sophisticated radar systems, her unparalleled fire control, and her dense, layered protection instilled a sense of invincibility. It was an understandable arrogance born of technological supremacy. They were ready for any battleship, any cruiser, any destroyer the Royal Navy could throw at them. They were ready for the giants of the sea. What they failed to appreciate, what they dismissed with casual laughter during training exercises, was the danger posed by the forgotten, the obsolete, and the slow. They were the apex of naval engineering, oblivious to the fact that their downfall would be executed by relics of a previous war, tiny fabric and wood aircraft that few took seriously. The massive, sophisticated guns of the Bismarck were positioned to destroy modern vessels, yet they were utterly unprepared for the shadow of an ancestor. October 19, 1939, aboard the deck of HMS Royal in the North Atlantic. This was the environment where the Fairey Swordfish reigned, a creature born fully formed into obsolescence. To look upon the Swordfish was to peer back across a generation of aeronautical science. It was a defiant anachronism, a canvas-covered skeleton of wood and metal tubing, held together by rigging wires and sheer operational necessity. Its fixed landing gear, clad in bulky fairings, remained down whether cruising the vast ocean expanse or landing on a bumpy carrier deck. Pilots joked darkly that the gear served a dual purpose, landing and creating drag. Its crew affectionately, or perhaps ironically, dubbed it the string bag. The moniker arose because, like the old-fashioned shopping receptacle, the Swordfish appeared capable of carrying everything: torpedoes, mines, depth charges, flares, radios, and a heavy three-man crew, but looked utterly incapable of doing so without unraveling. It was slow, glacially slow. When contemporaries like the Supermarine Spitfire and the Messerschmitt Bf-199 were screaming through the sky above 300 miles per hour, the Swordfish struggled to break the 140-mile-per-hour barrier, and often cruised loaded closer to 100 miles per hour, barely faster than the wind ripping past the masts of the ships it served. This lack of speed was the primary source of the mocking laughter that echoed in the mess halls of the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine. High Command in Berlin viewed the presence of the Swordfish in the Royal Navy's inventory not as a threat, but as proof of British industrial decline, a pitiful sign that they were forced to deploy museum pieces. The pilots of the Bismarck, sailing in their armored colossus that represented the zenith of naval striking power, were trained entirely to repel fast bombers and high-speed dive attack aircraft. Their fire control systems, the incredibly complex and sophisticated systems designed to calculate deflection and lead from modern targets, were reread utterly useless when confronted with an aircraft moving with the deliberate pace of a horse-drawn cart. The string bag, it turned out, flew below the threshold of effective flak targeting. Shells fused to explode at a certain altitude and speed would detonate far ahead or high above the slowly chugging biplane, leaving nothing but smoke trails and empty air around the lumbering machine. It could fly low, dangerously low, hugging the wave tops with an inherent stability that modern monoplanes could only dream of achieving. This stability, coupled with its immense urance and relative ease of maintenance, a structure of fabric and doped canvas, was far easier to patch in rough seas than stressed aluminum skin meant that the British had a machine perfectly suited for launching a torpedo straight into the unarmored hull of a battleship. By May 1941, desperation had replaced doctrine. The Bismarck, having already sunk the mighty HMS Hood, represented an existential threat to the sea lanes connecting Britain to the crucial lifeline of North America. Every available asset was thrown into the desperate hunt. The pursuit fleets were vast, yet the window for success was closing rapidly. High-speed battleships like the Rodney and King George V could not close the distance fast enough. The only chance lay in crippling the behemoth, slowing it down and fixing its location for the final decisive engagement. This task fell inevitably to the string bag, operating from the decks of HMS Victorious, and later HMS Royal. They were armed with the 18-inch Mark 12 torpedo, a weapon so notoriously unreliable that pilots often referred to its performance as a coin toss. It frequently failed to detonate, ran too deep, or broke up upon water entry. The weather during the hunt was atrocious, a gale-force storm whipping the North Atlantic into a frenzy of towering gray waves. Takeoff from the pitching decks of the carriers was a life-or-death gamble for the Swordfish crews. These obsolete aircraft, designed for mild coastal patrol, were battered mercilessly by winds that threatened to shred their fabric wings and tear away their rigging. Visibility dropped to near zero, forcing the three-man crew pilot, observer, and telegraphist/air gunner to rely on dead reckoning and sheer instinct to navigate the featureless, hostile ocean. Yet even in this tempest, the string bag proved robust, its simple structure absorbing stresses that would have cracked the metal skeletons of more advanced aircraft. When the pilots finally prepared for the attack, they knew their mission was suicidal. They were flying into the teeth of the most formidable anti-aircraft defense system ever mounted on a single vessel. They were flying planes that belonged in a museum, carrying torpedoes that often failed into a blizzard to strike a vessel nearly 30 times their size. The German gunners, still laughing, prepared to track the slow, obvious targets. They anticipated high, fast passes and dramatic evasion. They did not anticipate the relentless, slow, low approach of the string bag, flying literally under the radar beam, banking towards the colossal shadow of the Bismarck, ready to exploit the single fatal flaw in modern naval warfare: the unarmored space below the waterline. The string bags were lumbering sky moths drawn inexorably toward the roaring, shining light of the German guns, carrying the single, precise sting of destiny. May 26, 1941, 10:30 a.m. on North Atlantic, 49 degrees north, 20 degrees west. The air over the Bismarck was a cacophony of fear and fury, a storm of anti-aircraft fire tearing at the ancient fabric wings of the attacking biplanes. The German gunners, adjusting too slowly to the absurdly low altitude, watched in disbelief as one torpedo, among the handful released, ran true. It struck aft, beneath the thick belt armor, in the vulnerable region of the screws and rudders. For a moment, the crew felt only a dull, shuddering impact, not the massive explosive jolt expected from a modern warhead. Yet that dull thud sealed their fate. The force of the detonation buckled the shaft brackets and, critically, jammed both massive rudders permanently at 12 degrees to port. Aboard the flagship, Admiral Gunther Lütjens instantly recognized the mortal blow. The magnificent warship, which had steamed relentlessly westward toward the sanctuary of the French coast, was now reduced to sailing in a wide, slow circle, unable to hold a course, unable to evade. Every countermeasure, every desperate attempt to repair the damage, including seeing divers into the freezing, turbulent wash of the stern, failed. The Bismarck was afloat, fully battle-worthy in her great guns, but fundamentally lost. The high-speed dash was over, replaced by a crawl toward the inevitable. Lütjens knew the string of luck that had guided them through the Denmark Strait. The luck that allowed them to sink the Hood had abruptly vanished. The hunter was now the hunted, tethered to the spot by a minor structural failure caused by a weapon they had openly mocked just hours before. When the news reached Whitehall, the atmosphere of deep dread that had permeated the Admiralty for 3 days finally broke. The panic surrounding Operation Rheinübung had been immense. The successful breakout of Bismarck and her consort, Prince Eugen, represented the gravest strategic threat to the convoy routes since the war began. The loss of HMS Hood, the symbol of British naval dominance, had compounded the terror, leading to a state of near hysteria in certain naval command rooms. Churchill himself had ordered every available naval asset from the home fleet at Scapa Flow to force H steaming north from Gibraltar to hunt the lone raider. Now, with the contact confirmed and the enemy crippled, the pursuit instantly transitioned into a deadly closing trap. The British response was overwhelming, a testament to the absolute necessity of eliminating the threat. Battleships like HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, along with the heavy cruiser screen, began closing in, their captains driven by the memory of the Hood and the mandate to exact immediate vengeance. The final night of May 26, 1941, was characterized by relentless, close-range harassment. Captain Philip Vian's destroyer flotilla, composed of the Cossack, Maori, Sikh, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer Piorun, refused to let the crippled giant rest. They peppered the Bismarck with intermittent torpedo runs and gunfire through the blinding rain squalls, keeping the German crew exhausted, denying them the cover of darkness. It was a prolonged tactical torment designed to wear down the morale and, most importantly, keep the coordinates precisely fixed for the arrival of the heavy guns at dawn. Lucian sent his final message to Führer headquarters. Ship unmaneuverable. We shall fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. It was a message of profound resignation, acknowledging that the Atlantic adventure had ended just as it began. With a desperate, doomed engagement against insurmountable odds, isolated and facing the full force of the world's most powerful navy. Dawn on May 27th revealed the full horror of the coming confrontation. The sea was still rough, with squalls passing quickly, but visibility was clear enough for the decisive engagement. At a range of approximately 12 miles, HMS Rodney, already heavily involved in the search, opened fire, quickly followed by HMS King George V. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was an execution. Bismarck, unable to evade and struggling to adjust her list, could only attempt to bring her magnificent main batteries to bear. But the trajectory of her fire was erratic and ineffective. The British battleships, using precise radar-aided ranging, poured a continuous torrent of 16-inch and 14-inch shells onto the stationary target. Within 30 minutes, the forward fire control was destroyed, and one after another, the colossal main turrets, Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, were silenced or jammed. Flames poured from the bridge and superstructure. The proud, mighty warship was rapidly reduced to a burning, unresponding wreck, its great speed and formidable armor reared utterly irrelevant by a single immovable rudder. The final act was tragic and swift. Though British shells reduced the ship to a catastrophic ruin, it was ultimately scuttling charges set off by the surviving German engineers that allowed the Bismarck to slip beneath the waves at 10:40 Amiens. She took over 2,200 men with her, a staggering casualty rate that testified to the relentless violence of the chase, leaving only 114 survivors to be plucked from the icy water. The sinking of the Bismarck was not merely a tactical naval victory. It marked a profound shift in naval strategy. It affirmed unequivocally that the age of the unchallenged battleship, the undisputed queen of the seas, was fundamentally over. Air power delivered by the slowest, most ungainly plane in the British inventory had proven the decisive factor. The great chase, driven by Admiralty panic and fought with unparalleled intensity, consumed enormous resources and manpower, but delivered a psychological victory that resonated across the globe. The threat of the German surface fleet, though it would rise again in smaller operations, was fundamentally broken. The legacy of Bismarck is not found in its monumental firepower or thick armor plate, but in its vulnerability, a mechanical Achilles heel exposed by the very obsolescence the German Navy had mocked, teaching a brutal lesson about precision airstrikes that the world's navies would ignore at their extreme peril. May 18, 1941, the bustling anchorage of Gotenhafen, now known as Gdynia, under the cover of heavy mist and the watchful eye of Admiral Günther Lutyens, the battleship Bismarck, the largest and most modern warship afloat, slipped her moorings alongside the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. This departure initiated Operation Rheinübung, an audacious attempt to break out into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. Their mission was simple, yet strategically devastating: to hunt the convoys, sever the maritime lifeline sustaining Britain, and effectively choke the island nation into submission. The Bismarck was more than just a ship. She was a physical manifestation of Hitler's ambition for a blue water fleet, a terror weapon whose existence alone forced the Royal Navy to divert massive resources. Her 8 15-inch guns represented firepower that, theoretically, no single Allied vessel could withstand. For the British Admiralty, the news of her sailing provoked immediate, almost frantic action. The hunt was on before the prey had even left the territorial waters of the Baltic. But the sheer size and speed of the German force made interception a race against geography and time. The inevitable confrontation occurred just 6 days later in the cold, desolate fog of the Denmark Strait, the narrow channel separating Greenland and Iceland. Leading the British interception force was the most famous ship in the world, the battlecruiser HMS Hood. Launched decades before, the Hood was the pride of the Royal Navy, a symbol of its historical dominance. But beneath the polished veneer of tradition and fame lay a critical flaw: thin deck armor, a dangerous vulnerability born of outdated design principles. Alongside her sailed the new, powerful but still untested battleship HMS Prince of Wales. At 5:35 a.m., May 24th, the two forces sighted each other, emerging from the gloom at immense range. The moment of contact was electric, a clash of cymbals as much as steel. The Hood opened fire first, the initial salvos booming across the icy water, targeting the lead German ship, Prinz Eugen. The Germans swiftly returned fire, but Lütjens, recognizing the immense symbolic and strategic importance of the encounter, shifted the focus of Bismarck's massive 15-inch main battery toward the illustrious Hood. The exchange was devastatingly swift. Within minutes, the Germans found their range with uncanny precision. Bismarck's fourth salvo struck the Hood amidships, causing a fierce fire near the mainmast. Then, at 6 a.m. precisely, the fifth German salvo found its mark. One or more 15-inch shells plunged through the comparatively thin deck plating of the aging battlecruiser. The resulting explosion was catastrophic and instantaneous. The flash was immense, a towering pillar of fire and smoke that ripped the majestic warship in half. The great shock of the Atlantic War was not merely that a British ship had been sunk, but the speed and finality of the Hood's demise. A vessel 860 feet long, carrying a crew of 1,418 men, was utterly obliterated in under 3 minutes. Where the pride of the fleet had sailed moments before, there was only a churning vortex of smoke and icy water. Of the men aboard, only 3 survived. The psychological impact on the surviving ships, especially the crew of the Prince of Wales, who found themselves suddenly facing the German Leviathan alone, was profound. It was a terrifying realization that the Bismarck was, at that moment, untouchable, a floating fortress whose firepower exceeded anything the Royal Navy had placed in its path. The German ship had delivered a blow that resonated from the Admiralty war rooms to the furthest corners of the Commonwealth, shattering the deep-seated confidence in the supremacy of the British surface fleet. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, lethal, and demonstrated with horrific finality. Though the Prince of Wales, under heavy fire and suffering damage, managed to score several crucial hits on Bismarck before withdrawing one shell penetrating the German battleship's bow and causing a persistent oil leak. These small strategic victories were completely overshadowed by the sheer national grief and shock of the Hood's sinking. Bismarck had established its terrifying lethality, but in doing so it signed its own death warrant. The subsequent British reaction was instantaneous and absolute. Rage coalesced into a singular national determination for vengeance. Prime Minister Churchill famously ordered, "Sink the Bismarck." The disaster mobilized every available ship, from battleships and carriers hundreds of miles away to aging cruisers, transforming the strategic hunt into a furious pursuit driven by wounded national pride. The world's largest operational battleship had, in a single hour, become the most hunted vessel in history. The tragedy of HMS Hood demonstrated the brutal, unforgiving nature of modern naval warfare, when armor and firepower met in a perfect, fatal alignment. It highlighted the essential vulnerability of any vessel, no matter how great its fame or reputation, when confronted by superior, concentrated force aimed at a design weakness. Bismarck's triumph in the Denmark Strait, while establishing its own legacy status, also served as the highest possible incentive for the British to innovate and deploy the combination of air and sea power that would, ultimately, prove its undoing. The fate of the Hood ensures that the legacy of the Bismarck is forever bound up in 2 contradictory, shattering lessons: the peak of surface fleet power and its swift, violent demise. May 25, 1941. The British Admiralty War Room in London. The victory of the Bismarck was simultaneously the most catastrophic humiliation and the most profound strategic threat the Royal Navy had faced in the entire war. The sinking of the Hood was a blow to morale that could only be answered by the complete annihilation of the German battleship. Prime Minister Churchill issued a simple, uncompromising directive: "You must sink the Bismarck." Admiral Sir John Tovey, commanding the home fleet aboard HMS King George V, was entrusted with this imperative task. He immediately committed every available asset to the hunt. But as the day wore on, confusion began to mount. The German admiral, Günther Lütjens, knowing he had inflicted a terrible wound on the British psyche, used the ensuing tactical chaos and worsening weather to perform a masterful evasion. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 25th, while the shadowing cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk maneuvered to maintain radar contact, Bismarck abruptly turned a wide circle under cover of a squall and the radar's blind arc. The giant ship, which had been the singular focus of the entire Royal Navy, vanished. The tracking screens went blank. For 13 terrifying hours, the Bismarck was ghosting through the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. The silence from the German ship was deafening to the British ear. The Admiralty, believing Lutins would try to re-engage the trailing cruisers, wasted valuable time searching north and west. In reality, Lutjens had made his move directly southeast, aiming for the relative safety of the occupied French port Saint-Nazaire, being his ultimate target, where the massive dry dock could repair the fuel leak sustained during the Denmark Strait battle. The search radius expanded geometrically, overwhelming the already exhausted reconnaissance forces. Tovey had placed his greatest wager on the most likely route, pushing his weary battleships, which were already running low on fuel, relentlessly toward the Bay of Biscay. The crucial turning point came on the morning of May 26th. Nearly 48 hours after Bismarck disappeared, a solitary, long-range American-built Catalina flying boat, piloted by Ensign Leonard B. Smith of Coastal Command, spotted a massive smudge on the horizon, trailing across the turbulent gray surface of the ocean. Through a momentary break in the thick cloud cover, Smith saw it, the unmistakable profile of the Bismarck, tearing across the waves toward French air cover. The location immediately confirmed that Admiral Tovey's dangerous strategic gamble had paid off. The Bismarck was sighted 690 miles west of Brest. The gap was closing, but it was still too wide for the heavy surface ships to engage before the battleship could reach the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe. Only one force was within striking distance, Force H, steaming north at maximum speed from Gibraltar, led by Vice Admiral Somerville, and spearheaded by the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and the battle cruiser Renown. The clock was counting down to hours, not days. The weather was atrocious: gales, Force 8 and 9, mountainous seas and driving rain, the absolute worst conditions imaginable for operating fabric-winged aircraft. Nevertheless, the decision was immediate. The Swordfish must launch. The first attack wave from Ark Royal was fraught with peril, culminating in the embarrassing and dangerous near-disaster where the antiquated torpedo bombers mistook the cruiser HMS Sheffield, which was shadowing the target, for the Bismarck itself. Thankfully, the Sheffield signaled in time and managed to evade the incoming torpedoes. This near tragedy underscored the fatigue and the desperate nature of the British attack plans. As dusk approached, the weather conditions worsened, yet the vulnerability of the Bismarck became apparent. If the ship could not be sunk, it absolutely must be crippled before it slipped into the coastal zone. Admiral Somerville ordered a second, final strike. 15 Swordfish biplanes, slow and utterly obsolete by modern warfare standards, took off into the deepening gloom. These aircraft flew low, almost suicidally, through intense flak thrown up by the German gunners, who had every right to laugh at the very idea of a biplane attack on the most formidable battleship afloat. Despite the hellish defensive fire, 2 critical torpedo strikes landed. One hit amidships, doing minimal damage to the main armor belt, but the second struck far astern, exactly at the point where the hull protected the steering mechanism. The explosion jammed the massive twin-rudder system of the Bismarck. Immediately, the ship became uncontrollable. Lutjen's magnificent surface weapon, built for speed and long-range engagement, was suddenly reduced to a spinning mass, circling helplessly in the heavy Atlantic swell. The speed, which was meant to carry it to safety now, merely accelerated its unguided drift directly into the oncoming paths of the converging British heavy ships. The chase, spanning 3 days and thousands of miles of ocean, had ended not with a titanic surface engagement, not yet, but with a single crucial strike by the most improbable of weapons against the weakest point of the most formidable target. The swiftness and power of the battleship were reread meaningless, replaced by the humiliating, slow, inevitable death spiral. The very foundation of the doctrine of naval supremacy which relied on speed and decisive maneuver, had been physically negated by a small explosion against a vulnerable piece of steel. The once proud symbol of German naval power was now simply a stationary, doomed target, awaiting the concentrated firepower of a vengeful Royal Navy whose fury had been unleashed by the death of the Hood. The legacy of this desperate hunt remains the profound lesson that in modern warfare, the strongest armor means nothing if control is lost. The era of the all-powerful battleship was over, sunk not by a sister ship, but by the relentless coordinated evolution of air power, which had finally found its target and sealed the fate of a Titan. May 26, 1941, aboard the RAF Catalina PBY patrol bomber V, the crew had been flying a desperate low-altitude grid search for hours when, through a break in the squall, they sighted what the world had been holding its breath for: the unmistakable, enormous profile of the Bismarck steaming relentlessly toward the safety of the French coastline. This contact, made nearly 700 miles west of Brest, instantly transformed the massive strategic landscape. The British Admiralty knew they had mere hours, perhaps a day at most, before the German giant reached the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe. All subsequent operations pivoted around this single piece of intelligence, but getting to the target was a monumental challenge. The weather had worsened into a ferocious gale, churning the sea and shrouding the skies in thick, intermittent cloud cover. The primary striking force was Admiral Somerville's Force H, centered around the aircraft carrier HMS Royal, which had raced up from Gibraltar, battling the very same Atlantic turbulence. Aboard the Royal, the mechanics struggled to secure and prepare the temperamental Swordfish biplanes for what would certainly be one of the most hazardous launches of the war. These planes, known to the German naval officers primarily as slow, archaic distractions, were now the only tools capable of bridging the gap before Bismarck slipped away. The first strike launch that afternoon was a catastrophe of communication and identity. The weather was so brutal, the visibility so poor, and the pilots so focused on finding the enormous battleship that the attack group mistook the British light cruiser HMS Sheffield, which had been detailed to maintain contact with the Bismarck, for their quarry. 11 torpedoes were launched at the Fairey vessel. Fortunately, the torpedoes, armed with the newly deployed magnetic pistols that were notoriously unreliable, either detonated prematurely in the heavy seas or were skillfully dodged by the Sheffield's quick-thinking captain. The only lasting consequence was the waste of valuable time and the horrifying realization that the British air fleet was struggling profoundly against the elements. The pilots returned, chastened but determined, while the mechanics rearmed the Swordfish with conventional contact pistols, which required a direct hit but were less prone to malfunction. The storm only intensified. The crew of the Bismarck, meanwhile, remained alert but confident. They were steaming at speed, their formidable armor untested, and they believed they had successfully evaded the main bulk of the pursuing force. As dusk began to descend, painting the churning waves in hues of menacing gray, the second, crucial airstrike was launched. 15 Swordfish took off from the Royal, staggering into the gale, buffeted by winds so strong that several pilots doubted they could maintain control. This time there was no mistake. The immense gray hull of the Bismarck appeared beneath the scudding clouds, a fortress surrounded by towering anti-aircraft flak. The German response was immediate and overwhelming. Explosive shells rose from the battleship in thick black bouquets, forming a lethal wall around the lumbering biplanes. Aboard the Bismarck, the sight of the low, slow-flying fabric and wire planes induced a dangerous mix of contempt and fury. The air was filled with derisive laughter and shouted orders. How could these relics possibly pose a threat to the most technologically advanced warship afloat? Despite the concentrated fire, the antiquated design of the Swordfish proved, ironically, advantageous. Their speed was so low that the German gunners, accustomed to tracking faster targets, often aimed ahead of the aircraft, sing their lethal salvos harmlessly into the empty air behind them. The pilots pressed their attack, diving through the maelstrom of explosions. 2 torpedo hits were confirmed. The first struck midships, harmlessly exploding against the thick expanse of the armored belt. It caused superficial damage, a shudder throughout the ship, and some minor flooding, but did nothing to reduce speed or combat effectiveness. The second hit, however, was a miracle of engineering failure and desperate piloting. A single torpedo slammed into the stern, deep underwater, far aft of the main protective armor. This area was crucial, housing the machinery that controlled the 3 propellers and, most importantly, the twin rudders. The force of the detonation was absorbed largely by the rudders themselves. While the powerful German armor held firm against the bulk of the attack, this specific, low-probability strike jammed Bismarck's port rudder hard over. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The steering gear room was flooded, the mechanical connections shattered, and all attempts by the engineering crew to regain manual control failed. The captain of the Bismarck, Captain Lindemann, and Admiral Lutens watched in disbelief as their magnificent, powerful ship began to describe a massive, uncontrollable circle in the open ocean. The swift, straight run toward France was over. The 50,000-ton Titan, designed to withstand any assault, was no longer steering a course of its own choosing. She was driven instead, in a helpless arc back toward her furious pursuers, now steaming directly into the heavy weather that the Royal Navy could weather far better than an out-of-control giant. The loss of steering capability was, psychologically and operationally, the death blow. The Bismarck instantly devolved from a fordable predator to a floating gun platform, a target that could fight but could no longer maneuver or escape. The cost to the fleet air arm was minimal. Only 1 Swordfish was lost, though all were riddled with holes. But the price paid by the German Navy for dismissing the biplane was ultimate. This single, improbable strike landing against the most vulnerable point of the vessel sealed the contract of its destruction, illustrating the profound and timeless military truth that even the most overwhelming armor and firepower are re-read irrelevant the moment control and mobility are forfeited to the enemy. The ultimate final assault, now inevitable, would simply be the closing act of a drama already decided by a canvas and wood antique. May 26, 1941, late afternoon, 450 miles west of Brest, France. The immediate, dizzying confirmation that the rudder of the behemoth had been jammed transmitted a shockwave of relief through the beleaguered British Admiralty. Relief, however, was a luxury that could not be afforded. The Bismarck was crippled, yes, but she was afloat, still firing and merely 400 nautical miles from the safety of German air cover. The time window was impossibly small. It was now a race against the Calar and against the wind, a desperate sprint to bring the heavy guns of the home fleet to bear before the German Kriegsmarine could rescue its prize. This final opportunity rested entirely upon the fragile decks of HMS Royal and her sister carrier, Victorious, operating in meteorological conditions that bordered on operational suicide. The North Atlantic was showing its true colors, a churning, deep gray landscape whipped into a frenzy by a force 9 gale, gusting toward force 10. These were not conditions conducive to flying canvas biplanes, nor were they ideal for maintaining the complex balance of a heavy aircraft carrier. For the pilots of the 800 and 818 Naval Air Squadrons, launching from the pitching, bucking flight deck of Royal was a terrifying prospect. The carrier's bow repeatedly dipped into the mountainous waves, seeing plumes of spray over the deck, while the stern lifted, exposing the propellers and threatening to smash the low-flying Swordfish into the foam. Yet there was no alternative. The heavy British battleships, King George V and Rodney, though steaming at flank speed, were still many hours away. The destroyers, vital for keeping continuous contact, were nearing the critical of their fuel urance. If the Bismarck somehow managed to shake the shad hours, or if the weather worsened further, the entire chase, lasting over 4 agonizing days, would have been wasted. Admiral Tovey needed the Bismarck held, permanently and unmovably, until dawn. The success of that final, crucial strike, which now defined the fate of the surface engagement, had only come after previous devastating failures. Only hours before, a separate strike force from Royal had mistakenly engaged and fired upon the British cruiser HMS Sheffield, fortunately missing their target and highlighting the chaos of the chase. This subsequent and successful attack, navigating darkness, atrocious weather, and the threat of friendly fire, demanded a level of navigational skill and sheer nerve that was truly extraordinary. It cemented the belief among the operational command that the air arm was no longer a supporting element in the hunt, but the primary instrument of tactical victory. With the German giant listing slightly and unable to answer her helm, forced to motor in agonizing circles, the surface stage was finally set. The role of the destroyers became immediate and brutal. Captain Philip Vian, commanding the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, took charge of the night action. 5 small, fast ships, the Cossack, Maori, Sikh, Zulu, and the Polish destroyer Piorun, were ordered to maintain continuous harassment, relentlessly attacking the paralyzed battleship throughout the dark, stormy hours. These ships became the spearhead of the final vigil. They launched torpedo after torpedo into the rough seas, many missing their mark, but their primary mission was achieved in the psychological realm. For 12 continuous hours, from dusk until the cold gray of dawn, the destroyers circled, closing within 3 miles of the Bismarck to pepper her with shells and launch their payload. The German crew, already exhausted by the days of battle stations and the shock of the Rudder destruction, were denied sleep, denied rest, and denied the ability to effect meaningful repairs. Every time the destroyers closed, the colossal battleship had to answer with her secondary battery, expending precious ammunition and illuminating herself against the black, stormy horizon. The actions of Vian's flotilla were not intended to sink the Bismarck that was the mandate of the battleships closing from the west, but to ensure she remained broken, stationary, and demoralized. They held the line, sacrificing their own meager fuel reserves and risking complete annihilation should the Bismarck turn her main guns on them in a fit of desperation. As the first light of May 27, 1941, began to illuminate the furious ocean, the scene presented itself as the culmination of the naval chase of the century. The Bismarck was no longer the proud, unsinkable fortress that had departed the Baltic. She was a wounded, slow-turning target, her hull scarred and her machinery crippled, surrounded by the enemy she could no longer evade. This monumental final confrontation, the inevitable surface slugfest, was entirely predicated on the aerial success that preceded it. The carrier air groups operating under impossible meteorological constraints had bought the necessary hours for the surface fleet to close. It was the fusion of the naval antique, the slow, sturdy biplane, and the determination of exhausted men flying through a hurricane that stripped the Titan of its mobility, thereby ensuring the destruction of the centerpiece of Hitler's Atlantic ambition. The sinking of the Bismarck would be remembered for the shellfire and the torpedo impacts that finished her. But the profound truth was that the battle had been won, the little Swordfish, defying the laughter of history and the logic of modern warfare, claimed command of the seas through the simplest means, a single unanswerable act of strategic crippling. It forever solidified the aircraft carrier and the bravery of those who flew from her decks, not merely as a valuable component of the fleet, but as the supreme arbiter of maritime power. But that tactical supremacy was bought at the price of absolute audacity, an audacity the German sailors, and, where available, the German air observers, initially greeted with open derision, for the pilots of the Luftwaffe who were tasked with protecting the Atlantic skies, and for the ship's officers who stared through binoculars at the converging threat on the late afternoon of May 26, 1941. The sight was frankly comical. They had prepared themselves to fight jets, or at least heavily armored American bombers. Instead, the sky offered up the Fairey Swordfish, a creature seemingly resurrected from the training fields of 1917. The Swordfish, often derisively nicknamed the string bag by its own crews due to its patchwork construction and numerous bracing wires, lumbered through the gale-force winds and squalls. Its maximum speed was barely 140 miles per hour, slower than many high-performance cars of the era. To the men of the Bismarck, a ship that could sustain over 30 knots and boasted the finest armor protection in the world, the attacking aircraft looked less like weapons of war and more like elaborate kite models powered by buzzing little engines. German spotters, tracking the lumbering approach, reported the threat with incredulity. The biplanes were so slow, so maneuverable at low speeds and constructed mostly of wood and fabric that they presented an entirely different problem for the highly mechanized anti-aircraft system. The rapid-fire 20mm and 37mm guns were calibrated to lead high-speed metal aircraft. Trying to track the bobbing, weaving, 100-knot fabric targets felt like overkill, like using a siege cannon to swat a fly. There are accounts from survivors that laughter actually echoed across the bridge as the first wave of torpedo planes began their final treacherous descent into the heavy rain squalls. They laughed at the exposed positions of the air gunners sitting in open cockpits exposed to the North Atlantic spray. They laughed at the sound of the engines, not the frightening roar of power, but the high-pitched, insistent drone of radial engines fighting furiously against the wind. But laughter, in warfare, is often the immediate precursor to shock. The Bismarck responded with a tempest of steel. The sea around the biplanes erupted in geysers and the air crackled with the heavy tracers. It was a dense, almost impenetrable curtain of fire designed to eliminate anything that flew within a mile. Yet, the very slowness of the Swordfish became their strange shield. A faster plane committed to a fixed line of attack would have been shredded instantly. But the Swordfish, capable of minute adjustments, simply drifted through the gaps in the flak, exploiting the inability of the automated fire control to lock onto such an erratic, slow-moving target. The attack group, led by Lieutenant Commander John Moffett, flew through conditions that should have grounded them permanently. The turbulence was violent, and the visibility dropped to near zero in the squalls, forcing the pilots to fly mere feet above the churning gray waves to maintain orientation. To launch the torpedoes, they had to achieve a straight, level run for about a mile. This required extraordinary commitment and focus in the face of what the Germans moments earlier had considered a harmless spectacle. Then came the impacts. 2 torpedoes hit in the crucial final attack run. The first struck amidships, a heavy, jarring blow that the armor belt absorbed. It caused little serious damage, but the sound, dull and enormous, immediately silenced the laughter on the bridge. The second was the unanswerable blow, launched by Moffett himself, striking far aft on the starboard quarter. The report that came screaming up to the command center was immediate and terrifying. The rudder was jammed, not merely damaged, but fixed permanently in a turn to port. The scorn vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, leaden horror. The ridiculous, slow, outmoded aircraft had succeeded where every modern destroyer and every heavy cruiser had failed in the preceding days. They had delivered a simple, devastating wound that no amount of armor or speed could overcome. The most powerful battleship afloat, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was now circling helplessly in the vast, unforgiving ocean, unable to steer away from the forces rapidly closing in for the kill. The German pilots who saw the Swordfish later, whether in the air or on the reconnaissance reports, no longer saw a relic. They saw a ghost. They saw the manifestation of strategic failure and emblem of the danger of underestimating simplicity. The Swordfish, that canvas and wire mockery of modern aviation technology, had exposed the central weakness of Germany's naval doctrine, reliance on overwhelming, singular technological superiority rather than resilient, adaptive ingenuity. The irony of the situation, that the great sea beast was brought low by what amounted to a glorified kite, was not lost on the officers who spent the freezing night trying, in vain, to correct the damage. The saga of the Bismarck became, for the rest of the war, a stark operational lesson. It forever immortalized the pilots who flew the stringbag, not just for their impossible accuracy under fire, but for their mental fortitude in facing the most technologically advanced ship in the world with a plane that belonged in a museum. Their victory over the great battleship remains a powerful testament to the enduring truth of conflict, that the speed of your platform is meaningless if the heart and commitment of the pilot flying it cannot be matched, and that sometimes the slowest, most unlikely adversary holds the power to change the course of history simply by being too stubborn, too brave, and too close to ignore. May 26, 1941, over the frigid North Atlantic, the true genius of the attack was not the heroism of the airmen, which was undeniable, but the unintentional technical brilliance of the obsolete airframe they piloted. The Fairey Swordfish was a relic, a biplane constructed of wood, fabric, and wire, incapable of exceeding 100 knots when laden with torpedoes. This laughable slowness was precisely the factor that reread the cutting-edge anti-aircraft defenses of the battleship Bismarck, temporarily deaf and blind. The German war machine, particularly its newest centerpiece, relied heavily on predictive fire control. These were highly sophisticated systems, based on complex analog computers designed to calculate the precise lead necessary to intercept incoming enemy aircraft. They were built for the future. Fast monoplanes like the Spitfire or the high-speed twin-engined bombers that would eventually plague the Reich. The system needed input on range, speed, and trajectory, and then, with impressive speed, it delivered the necessary aiming solution to the gun layers. But that day, against the slow-moving Swordfish, the input data broke the machine. Imagine a highly precise clock, built to measure seconds, being asked to measure geological epochs. The system was simply not designed to process a target moving that lethargically. The minimum target velocity programmed into the Bismarck's primary fire directors far exceeded the maximum speed of the attacking torpedo planes. When the rangefinders fed the velocity of 95 knots into the computing mechanisms, the resultant fire solution was often either erratic, delayed, or simply non-existent. The German gunners, expecting precise direction from their flawless technology, were instead faced with director pointers that refused to settle, unable to calculate the necessary lead for such a slow, near-hovering target. The planes were, paradoxically, too slow to be accurately shot down. This effect was compounded by the Swordfish's tactics of flying not just slow, but dangerously low. The pilots descended to mast height, hugging the wave-tops to minimize their exposure and maximize their torpedo's chance of a shallow run. This extreme low altitude introduced another critical failure point for the German defenses. The ship's heavy anti-aircraft weaponry, the devastating 105mm cannon, intended to create walls of flak at medium altitude, possessed a minimum depression angle. As the Swordfish closed the distance, darting toward the hull, they would fly beneath the effective engagement zone of these larger weapons, which could not tilt down far enough to track them against the sea surface. The defense was thus relegated largely to the medium and light caliber, guns the 37mm and 20mm flak cannons. But even here, the slow speed and low altitude played a crippling trick on technology. Many of the heavier flak shells were equipped with proximity fuses designed to detonate close to the target, maximizing fragmentation damage. These fuses required a certain distance and time in flight to arm correctly, because the Swordfish pilots closed in to point-blank range releasing their torpedoes, often less than 1,000 yards from the massive battleship. Many of the shells passed through the biplane's struts and rigging, or exploded harmlessly in the water beyond, having not traveled far enough to arm. The pilots, flying through a spectacular fountain of near misses and underarmed bursts, described the sensation as merely flying through heavy rain. The resulting scene was one of unparalleled operational confusion for the German crew. Highly trained professionals, manning the most advanced naval weaponry in the world, were utterly unable to deal with an adversary that appeared to belong in a flying circus rather than a naval strike group. The confidence placed in technological superiority evaporated under the stress of manual calculation. The German gunners, accustomed to the swift, decisive accuracy of computer-assisted aim, struggled to manually track and lead a target that seemed to defy the laws of probability by moving so slowly while remaining airborne. They could not switch quickly enough to the crude human method required to track this anomaly. The victory of the Swordfish over the Bismarck was more than a display of raw courage. It was a profound illustration of the limits of technological specificity. The Germans had designed their systems to beat the most advanced known threats, failing to account for the possibility that the British might be forced by necessity to employ the least advanced. The Swordfish, the ridiculed string bag, did not just sink a ship, it exposed the fatal flaw in pre-war technological doctrine, that concentrating solely on the fastest and highest threat leaves one dangerously vulnerable to the slowest and lowest. This paradox resonated throughout the war and beyond. It forced naval architects and ordnance designers to immediately re-evaluate defensive perimeters, ensuring that future ships possessed layered defenses capable of engaging targets across the entire spectrum of velocity and altitude, from the swift jet aircraft that would soon appear, down to the slowest fabric-covered menace. The legacy of the Swordfish is that the definition of a threat must always include the unthinkable, the absurd, the adversary so seemingly outmatched that its very existence is dismissed. The slowest machine, piloted by the bravest hearts, demonstrated that the most sophisticated defense is only as strong as its forgotten blind spot forever, cementing the memory of the Bismarck, not just as a mighty ship defeated, but as the proving ground where technological arrogance was utterly humiliated by persistent, stubborn simplicity. May 26, 1941, 9 p.m., southwest of Ireland. The sea was a violent, mountainous field of deep green and gray, churned by a full gale blowing at force 9. This was the final throw of the dice for the British home fleet. The pride of the Kriegsmarine, the battleship Bismarck, was now barely 370 miles from the safety of the French coast, positioning herself under the imminent protection of the Luftwaffe and supporting U-boat screens. If she reached Saint-Nazaire, the pursuit would be over and the strategic victory belonged unequivocally to Hitler's navy. The aircraft carrier HMS Royal was pitching and rolling so violently that the Swordfish biplanes assigned to this final desperate strike run were struggling simply to remain lashed to the deck. These weren't the crews that had, by tragic error, accidentally attacked their own cruiser HMS Sheffield earlier in the day. These were the fresh attack waves launching into a hurricane, carrying torpedoes specifically designed for shallow water operation, a cruel irony given the thousands of feet of water beneath them. Visibility was near zero, and the turbulence was so extreme that pilots reported being thrown up and down by 50 feet in a single second. The mission required an almost suicidal courage, simply to launch, let alone attempt a precise attack on the most heavily armored warship in the world. The Swordfish were flying into a soup of oil and brine, their fabric wings shuddering under stresses they were never meant to endure. As they approached the designated target coordinates, they pierced the squalls and found the Bismarck, black and immense against the fading twilight, already engaging them with a tremendous barrage. The German anti-aircraft gunners, now utterly tired of the slow, droning harassment of these biplanes, fired everything they had. The flak was not sporadic. It was described by one pilot as a continuous, dense cloud of exploding shell, a curtain of solid iron. The Swordfish had to fly straight through. The Germans held a core belief that their heavy armor belt, nearly 13 inches thick, read the ship invulnerable to the low-speed, 450-pound warheads carried by the British torpedoes. They correctly assumed that any hit along the main hull would simply shatter the wooden casing of the weapon or cause only superficial damage. Their entire defense doctrine, however, was focused on protecting the mass of the vessel, neglecting the essential, fragile extremities. 3 biplanes, flying through the worst of the firestorm, positioned themselves on the starboard quarter, running parallel to the ship at masthead height. It was impossible to miss the sheer violence radiating from the Bismarck. The massive hull was generating its own weather system as it raced through the gale. 2 torpedoes splashed home quickly, one glancing off the main armor belt, confirming the German calculations of protection, and the second hitting amidships on the port side, near the secondary boiler rooms, causing flooding but no structural catastrophe. Then came the final critical moment. Pilot Lieutenant John Muffet, flying alongside observers J.D. Dusty Miller and gunner Albert Chapman, maneuvered his biplane into an almost impossible position. He aimed not for the hull, but for the very stern, the ship's weakest, lowest point, the region where the propellers and, crucially, the rudder assembly were situated, a zone necessarily outside the confines of the massive armored citadel. Moffat released his torpedo at the shortest possible range, barely 300 yards, flying so low that his undercarriage skimmed the mountainous wave crests. He immediately hauled the frail aircraft into a steep climbing turn to avoid colliding with the giant stern of the battleship he was attacking. The torpedo trekked true through the churning water. There was no colossal explosion, merely a dull, heavy thump. a sound drowned instantly by the roar of the flak and the gale. But that dull thump was the sound of doom. The torpedo struck the Bismarck exactly where the port rudder and the steering engine room converged. The force of the detonation was not enough to create a massive hole in the hull itself, but the concussive effect transmitted directly through the steering gear housing catastrophically jammed both rudders hard over to port, completely disabling the primary steering mechanism. Aboard the Bismarck, the change was immediately terrifying. The great ship, once so responsive, began to slow. The German captain, Ernst Lindemann, ordered immediate countersteering with the main engines, attempting to use differential power running one engine forward, one reverse to compensate for the locked rudders. This was a technique possible in calmer waters, but utterly futile in a force 9 gale. The relentless wind and the immense weight of the ship, fighting against the fixed rudders, seized control. The crew on the bridge watched in stunned disbelief as their 1,000-foot technological monolith, the pride of the fleet, began a slow, unalterable turn into the northwest, directly back into the wind, and more critically, directly back toward the pursuing British fleet. All attempts by damage control parties to clear the steering engine room of water, debris, and fuel oil proved useless. The rudders were jammed solid. The greatest battleship afloat was now nothing more than a colossal floating gun platform divorced from its own navigational will. The Swordfish had not sunk the Bismarck, they had sentenced her to death. They stripped her of the only thing a warship needs to survive a naval engagement, the ability to maneuver and dictate terms of combat. She became a magnificent, powerful piston without a lever, unable to use her speed to escape the inevitable encirclement. The final agonizing 20 hours of the Bismarck's life would be spent steaming in unavoidable circles, waiting for the arrival of the enemy battleships, her fate sealed by the courage of the overlooked, exposed forever, the crucial truth of modern warfare, that the true measure of technological sophistication lies not in the size of the gun or the thickness of the plate, but in the protection of the humble essential systems, and that arrogance in any theater of conflict is merely the precursor to destruction. May 27, 1941, 8:37, 1941, 8:47, Amiens. In the dark, churning waters of the North Atlantic, the final dawn broke not with hope, but with the inevitable echo of retribution. For 20 hours, the great German battleship had been a prisoner of the elements and her own damaged engineering, steaming slowly westward in wide, painful arcs. The British destroyers, having maintained their aggressive, sleepless picket line through the foul weather, had successfully shepherded their prize into the waiting maws of the heavy battle squadron. The sea, whipped into a gray-green fury by the gale, bore witness to the conclusion of the Atlantic chase. The Bismarck was no longer the magnificent, intimidating symbol of naval power she had been 3 days prior. She was a crippled machine, her rudder jammed, her speed non-existent, her decks already battered by repeated sporadic shell fire from the tireless destroyers. Yet she was defiant. Admiral Tovey's forces approached in a concentrated semicircle of overwhelming force. The battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, followed by the heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire. The first cataclysmic salvos erupted from the Rodney, bearing down almost head-on, delivering a murderous horizontal fire that instantly stripped away the myth of the Bismarck's invulnerability. The Rodney, old but armed with 16-inch guns, fired at near point-blank range, rapidly followed by the 14-inch rounds from the King George V. The sheer volume of concentrated British fire was unprecedented in the conflict, designed not to disable but to annihilate. Within 10 minutes of the opening barrage, the Bismarck's forward fire control position was wrecked, eliminating the ability of the ship to effectively calculate range and trajectory. Soon after, the massive forward turrets, Anton and Bruno, fell silent, either disabled by direct hits or jammed. The German crew fought with ferocious, desperate courage, maintaining fire from the aft turrets, Caesar and Dora, but the unequal fight was already decided. The British ships, capable of maneuvering at high speed, circled their prey, utilizing their superior fire control to systematically dismantle the pride of the Kriegsmarine. The battle became a relentless, one-sided execution. Shell after shell tore through the superstructure, transforming the command deck into a smoking charnel house. By 9:30 a.m., the main mast was gone, the secondary armament destroyed, and the funnels perforated. All four of the Bismarck's massive primary gun turrets were now silent, either jammed, flooded, or abandoned. The ship's upper works were utterly pulverized, a landscape of burning, twisted steel. Yet the armored citadel, the thick belt of German steel, stubbornly refused to yield to the explosive shells. The Bismarck was a hulk, burning fiercely from stem to stern, devoid of offensive capability, yet she would not sink. Admiral Tovey, seeing the floating wreck incapable of fighting back, but wasting valuable fuel and ammunition, ordered the cruisers to close in and sink her with torpedoes. The intention was to ensure the was swift and absolute, and to mitigate the growing fear of German U-boats approaching the scene. The heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire moved in for the final gruesome attack. Launching 2 torpedoes at the starboard side, they impacted against the armored belt. They did little initially, but the 3rd torpedo struck midship on the port side, and the cumulative damage finally fractured the hull below the waterline. Simultaneously, deep within the smoke-choked flooding decks of the Bismarck, a terrible final command was given. Faced with the certainty of capture or slow destruction, Captain Ernst Lindemann's surviving officers initiated the pre-planned scuttling procedure. Explosive charges were detonated in the engineering spaces and below the waterline to guarantee the ship's own destruction and prevent her technology from falling into enemy hands. The combination of the British torpedoes and the internal demolitions proved fatal. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., the great ship began to list heavily to port. Slowly, agonizingly, the behemoth turned turtle, rolling completely over as the vast expanse of her red-painted keel lifted clear of the churning water. In a final, tremendous rush of air and steam, the Bismarck plunged bow first into the freezing depths, disappearing beneath the waves at 10:40 immediate. The immediate aftermath was horrific. Over 2,000 sailors were pitched into the glacial North Atlantic, while HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Maori attempted to rescue survivors. The sighting of a U-boat forced the British ships to abandon the scene prematurely, leaving hundreds of men to perish from exposure. Only 114 men of the proud ship's company survived. The destruction of the Bismarck served as a brutal strategic punctuation mark. It was not merely the loss of a ship, but the definitive of Germany's surface fleet threat to the vital Atlantic convoys. Her sinking exposed the strategic weakness inherent in the doctrine of relying on a few highly sophisticated prestige ships without adequate air support or sea control. It validated the power of the overlooked biplane that had ensured her immobilization, and it confirmed the chilling efficiency of concentrated naval power. The great ship rests still today, nearly 5 kilometers down on the seabed, a magnificent ruin, standing sentinel over the memory of the men who perished with her. Her brief, violent career epitomized the rapid, unforgiving evolution of naval warfare. The Bismarck had been built as the ultimate statement of German technological supremacy, yet in her death she proved a profound enduring lesson that the greatest weapons of war, no matter how armored or advanced, are ultimately fragile, and that even the most formidable steel giants can be brought low by a single perfectly placed strike. Her loss marked the true of the era of the battleship as the undisputed sovereign of the sea, yielding forever to the inevitable dominance of the aircraft carrier. May 27, 1941, the Admiralty War Room, London. The final radio reports confirming the demise of the German Leviathan did not bring simple relief. They brought a sudden, chilling clarity regarding the future of naval power. The slow, canvas-winged Swordfish was obsolete even before the war began. German airmen had openly mocked it, nicknaming it the string bag for its antiquated appearance and construction of fabric stretched over wire. Yet this fragile machine, flying barely above the water and relying on the element of surprise and the sheer luck of the North Atlantic weather, delivered the fatal, crippling blow that countless shells from modern warships could not. The irony is profound and absolute. The The Bismarck, a billion-dollar fortress designed to withstand the world's most powerful artillery, was reread helpless by a primitive 10-shilling piece of aluminum and explosive dropped from a plane that looked scarcely fit to fly. The immediate cost of this demonstration was staggering. Over 2,000 men went down with the Bismarck. Their sacrifice underscored the true bloody price of naval supremacy and the inherent futility of constructing such enormous, slow-to-turn targets when the threat was coming relentlessly from above. The great battleship, which required years of labor and mountains of resources, was ultimately reread helpless in a matter of minutes, unable to maneuver away from its own doom. The Swordfish did more than sink a single German ship. It sank an idea, the foundational, century-long belief that the battleship was the undisputed sovereign of the sea. The sheer fact of the Bismarck's vulnerability, exposed by a technological dinosaur, shattered the long-held doctrine that armor and heavy guns guaranteed victory. After this cataclysmic encounter, every major naval power began the irreversible process of reorienting their doctrines around the carrier fleet. The Swordfish, the slow, roaring relic, became the accidental executioner of the era of the giant gunship, championing the age of naval aviation not through superior design, but through audacious, perfectly timed success. The legacy of the Bismarck is thus twinned with the legacy of the Swordfish. The swift, violent of the German giant signaled the technological future of maritime conflict, relegating the mighty battleship forever to the historical shelf. What remains now, miles deep in the frigid Atlantic abyss, is a vast, silent, tomb-like monument to the hubris of armor and speed. The wreck of the Bismarck remains a permanent physical reminder that the destiny of naval conflict was not written in thick German steel, but on the delicate, oil-stained wings of an outdated, unheralded biplane. The string bag won the day, silencing the giant forever.